Finally, Vasya was in a special bio chamber, all behind a transparent curtain. No one was allowed inside. Through the curtains, they gave him his shots and all. He got so bad I couldn't leave the room. He called for me constantly. Finally, the orderlies refused to work. They had soldiers wipe the walls, change the bedding. Then every day, someone died. Tashora is dead. Titenyok is dead. And every death is like a sledgehammer to my brain. I remember someone saying, "You have to understand, this is not your husband anymore, but a radioactive object with a strong density of poisoning. You're not suicidal. Get a hold of yourself." But I remembered how at home he always took my hand and held it all night while he slept. And so in the hospital, I take his hand. One day he says, "I want to see our child so much." "Well, what should we call our child?" I ask. "You decide," he says. "Why me? There are two of us." "Well, in that case, if it's a boy, he'll be Vasya. And if it's a girl, Natasha." One day I walk into the hallway and I say to the nurse, "He's dying." "Well, what did you expect? He got 1,600 Röntgen. 400 is a lethal dose. He's a nuclear reactor." When all the men had died, they redid the whole hospital. They scraped the walls and dug up the parquet floors. One day I left Vasya to go to the cemetery with Tanya for the burial of her man and another one. And when I came back, the nurse said that Vasya had died. And she said that he called your name at the end. And I told him you'd be right back. At the morgue, they dressed him in formal wear, but they had to cut up the shoes and uniform because they couldn't get him into it. His body was all swollen, distorted. At the end, pieces of his lungs, his liver, were coming out of his mouth. In this formal wear, they put him in a cellophane bag and then into a wooden coffin. They wrapped the coffin in another clear bag, and they told all of us that it was impossible for us to take their bodies home. They said they are very radioactive, and they will be buried in a Moscow cemetery in sealed zinc caskets under cement tiles. All you need to do is sign this document here.
Finally, I get in to see Shlunkov and tell him we have to save these people, that in Ukraine they are already evacuating. He says, "Why are your men from the Institute running around with their meters, scaring everybody? I've already consulted with Moscow, with Professor Ilyin, chairman of the Soviet Radiological Protection Board. He says everything is normal. We've thrown in the army. All our military equipment is in the breach." Now, you have to understand, and you should know, at Chernobyl, we have thousands of tons of cesium, iodide, lead, zirconium, cadmium, beryllium, borium, unknown amounts of plutonium, 450 types of radionuclides in all, equivalent to 350 atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima. I said to Shlunkov, who had been director of a tractor factory, "When they call people to account, you're going to say you're a tractor specialist." that you didn't understand what radiation could do. But I'm a physicist. I know the consequences. But from his point of view, what was this? A bunch of physicists, some professors were going to tell the Central Committee what to do? No, he and the others weren't a gang of criminals. It was a conspiracy of ignorance and obedience. The principle of their lives was never to stick their necks out. Their worst fear was panic, and the truth would come out, and they'd lose their jobs. They just wanted to cover it up, all that had happened. Believe me, if we were still in the Soviet Union, still living in a closed system, people would still be living right next to Chernobyl now.
Anna Badieva, a peasant who moved back into the contaminated zone after the disaster.
My first scare was, in the garden and yard, we'd find all these strangled moles. Who strangled them? Usually moles don't come out from underground. And when my son calls from Gomel, he asks if the black flies are out. No bugs, not even maggots, I tell him. No worms either. So he says, that's the first sign. If there aren't any bugs or worms, that means strong radiation. What's radiation? I ask. Mom, that's a kind of death. Mom, tell Grandma that you need to leave. You'll come stay with us. But we haven't planted the vegetable garden yet. Sometimes I turn on the radio and they scare us with radiation. But our lives have gotten better since radiation came. Look around. They brought us oranges, 3 kinds of sausage, and whatever you want. And here, to the village. My grandchildren have been all around the world to see doctors. And what is this radiation? Have you seen it? Some people say it has no color, no smell, and others that it's black like the earth. How they scare us. But the apples are hanging in the garden. The leaves are on the trees, the potatoes in the field. I don't think there was any Chernobyl. They just made it up. They tricked people. My sister and her husband left. But there are things that happened. Grandpa kept bees, 5 hives of them. They didn't come out for 2 days. They just stayed in there. They were waiting. Grandpa didn't know about the explosion, but he was running all over the yard saying, "What's the matter? What's happening? What's going on?" The radio wasn't saying anything then, but the bees knew. And if I think about it, in every house, someone has died. On that street over there across the river, all the women are without men. And if you think about it, all of our women are empty. Their female parts are ruined in the old and the young. Not all of them manage to give birth in time. They scare us that even the water you can't drink. But how can you do without water? Every person has water inside her. Even rocks have water. All life comes from water. What else will I say? Who can you ask? People pray to God, but they don't ask Him. You just have to live.